in December, at long last, we're going to get our eyeballs onto a brand new attempt at adapting the Percy Jackson and the Olympians franchise, as Disney releases the first season of the Percy Jackson show on Disney+. And yeah, to say I'm hyped is an understatement. After watching the first trailer, I was hesitant. But the second trailer managed to quite quickly turn things around for me, and now I'm all aboard the hype train. But the reality remains that this is an adaptation, and adaptations are known to take creative liberties from time to time. Historically, this has been for the worse for the franchise, with the OG films alienating the built-in audience right from the get-go, being so bad and changing so much that the author and the fandom as a whole have pretty much completely disowned them. And you know what? Fair enough, they are pretty bad as a whole, but the reality is, adapting a book is not a one-to-one process, and even with the author on board as a writer and producer, well, we've already seen the creative take it in different directions based on what they think is going to make for a better screen adaptation, what they think will make for a better cinematic experience, and on top of that, we now have all the episode titles for the first season, with the rough understanding that the episodes are going to go for maybe an hour or so each, maybe less. Realistically, they're going to be an hour with credits. After all, this is Disney Plus we're talking about. And so, yeah, I guess nothing else for it but to work our way through and see what sticks and what doesn't. Okay, so episode 1 is called I Accidentally Vaporized My Pre-Algebra Teacher. And the second episode is going to be called I Become Supreme Lord of the Bathroom. So yeah, it's clear they're going with chapter titles. And so the first episode is clearly going to be serving as your prologue, the introduction to the world of Percy Jackson. And when you read the book again, you very quickly realize just how short it is, how little is in there. And so, even covering just a couple of chapters, it's not going to fill out a whole lot of time except for the action which you can stretch out, especially since you no longer have that inner monologue of Percy to try to keep you invested with his thoughts. Some shows can handle an internal monologue, but in a live action format, I really do think we've been conditioned to find it very silly and hokey for you to be able to hear what the characters are thinking out loud. And so, outside of very specific circumstances, I think you got to keep that stuff for anime. So yeah, the deeply obvious starting point of the show would probably be either a bit of narration by Percy, which feels like it fits in with the book a bit more. Narration doesn't feel out of place. Or you simply do what the movie did and introduce some of the godly characters. But the more I think about it, the more I think that it's best if Percy starts with the narration and you don't show the gods and the supernatural until a little bit later. Keep it a little bit of mystery at first, because I think it does kind of preserve the jump scare of when the teacher tries to kill him and shit hits the fan in the museum. Because honestly, they're going to try to target this show to the casuals that have never heard of this franchise before, build a big audience. And I think that's a great moment to really hook that new audience, to grab them and keep them for the subsequent episodes. After all, I can pretty much guarantee that the hardcore audience, the audience that have read all the books and were clamoring for a reboot, they're going to watch no matter what. But the casual audience, they need a little bit of proof that this is worth their time, especially if the episodes are going for like an hour each. And so I think you need to hook them early with something dramatic. A creepy encounter with a monster should do the trick. And then of course you have to build at the end the hook for episode 2 to make you want to come back and watch that episode when it releases. And to me there's a very, very obvious endpoint of episode 1, which would be with the Minotaur encounter. The climax being that he, Grover, and his mum get attacked by a Minotaur just outside of Camp Half-Blood, and his mum gets abducted by Hades. And then you have Percy pass out or whatever, and that's a very exciting cliffhanger that will potentially keep that casual audience, who may or may not be familiar at all with the show or the books, coming back for more. But of course, when you look at the book and you see the sequence of events where he goes back to Gabe's apartment, meets up with his mum, and they leave, despite it being a couple of chapters, not much happens at all. Not enough in my eyes to stretch it out for 60 minutes. And so I do expect to see a fair chunk of added stuff, added exposition in this episode too. Obviously they'll still want to maintain a few mysteries to be unveiled as the episodes unfold, and they won't want to show characters like Poseidon or anything like that too early. So as much as I hate it, you're gonna need a lot of dialogue. You don't want to cut away to flashbacks or other character stories just yet. It needs to focus solely on Percy. You need to focus on the mystery of what's happening to him and the escape to Camp Half-Blood, but I think they also have to dive a little bit more into Gabe. In the book, he's there for hardly any time, a couple lines, a page or so, but in the show, you have to show more of him. You have to make the audience really hate this dude's guts and thus celebrate his murder at the end. Make it very clear that he sucks, that he's abusive, and that he slaps Sally around. You have to make it clear to the audience early on just how abusive and trashy he is. Because then, every time you see him in the news reports as Percy's traveling across America, It'll make that hatred bubble up again and again and again and make the ending really cathartic. Next up, episode 2, I become Supreme Lord of the Bathroom. And here, well, it's clearly just the Camp Half-Blood stuff. Capture the flag, Poseidon's his father reveal. That just feels like the natural end of this episode. And yeah, like this episode, already in the book, it's going to have a shit ton of exposition to get things started. You got to meet everybody, camp tour, learn about gods and demigods, and then the capture the flag battle, which should be pretty hype and take up a fair chunk of time. So I don't really see how you'd need to add anything. Yeah, you could stretch things out, but the action and the build-up to the reveal of Percy's parentage should be dominating this episode. And it should all lead up to Percy using his powers in the battle, and Poseidon publicly claiming him as his son. It's a really self-explanatory episode that doesn't need anything added to it at all. And honestly, this episode is already one that I'm suspecting is going to be an absolute banger. If the first episode doesn't draw the casuals, I think this will. But I think it's the next episode that maybe is going to need some tinkering. We visit the Garden Gnome Emporium, and that involves Percy in the aftermath of learning who his father is, being sent out on a quest to clear his name, as Zeus thinks he's stolen the lightning bolt on Poseidon's orders. The Medusa fight is also a pretty key part of this episode here, as is the beginning of their road trip, and the bus debacle. But I also think that having just skimmed back through some of the chapters, simply being told that Zeus is pissed off at him, this is not enough. In the book it's fine because once again it's a POV of Percy, but here, in the show, I think you'd want to cut away to the gods on Olympus to get a bit of context. It works fine for the book, but when you're watching something, the big rule should be show, don't tell. Chiron simply telling Percy everything, I'd much prefer that Chiron starts to explain what's going on, and then it does a cutaway so we can see for ourselves. See the brothers getting into it on Olympus. But maybe that's just me, I don't know. And yeah, also the Medusa fight is key here. And in the book, doesn't take that long. They kind of kill her quite quickly. I feel like they will extend this too. The rest, let's be real, you don't want to be sitting through long monologues or dialogue for too long. You don't want them at the camp for ages. You want the characters out on the road and getting the plot well and truly underway. You want to see the bond between the trio start to shape. And yeah, this episode and the next episode, I Plunge to My Death, feels like they're going to be majorly loaded with action. I mean, not long after the whole Medusa fight comes the encounter with Echidna, which is a really important one for Percy's character as she whips his ass in St. Louis and Percy takes his first major L of the franchise. On top of that, here he gets a mystical summons from his father to go to Santa Monica in California after he's saved from dying of poison. But I think the problem is that when you read this chapter in the books, and really the chapters around it, it isn't long. And whilst there is the talk between the trio beforehand, I don't think this combined with the Echidna fight, which is relatively short because she whips his ass, is not long enough to carry an episode. So either we're going to have a bunch of shorter episodes back to back, which lame, or they need to extend things out, preferably by either adding a little bit more team bonding, or maybe cutaways to Olympus, or even to Camp Half-Blood. I think it would be good to see more of Luke before he betrays everybody. You gotta let the casuals have that feeling of betrayal that comes in the books. And it comes in the books because Percy thinks about Luke, and he likes Luke, but you're not gonna see that play out on screen very much if they're not together. So you wanna see him so you can feel like, what the hell, man? What'd you do this for? But moving on. Because then we come to the next episode, A God Buys Us Cheeseburgers. You have that fateful meeting with Ares, which is a pretty key scene. Another one of those scenes that really is there to just set the tone of the franchise, because he's the first real dangerous god that Percy meets. Yeah, there's Mr. D, and Mr. D does threaten Percy that one time, but it's not the same vibe as Ares, who feels like he's a second away from smashing in your skull every second he speaks. It adds another layer of danger having such an intimidating character suddenly appear, throw his weight around, and then leave. And then you have the Tunnel of Love sequence, which is pretty iconically famous, in terms of the book fandom at least. And it should be decently hype and have a funny payoff, where Ares reveals he's tricked them into going there in order to trigger some traps so he can take Aphrodite there on a date later without any fear from Hephaestus. And yeah, I also think that maybe this episode's going to need a little extra. You could extend out the Tunnel of Love, but once again, this is a case of, on the page, seeming like more than it is, as so much of it happens in Percy's head, especially when he's just mean-mugging Ares and being a hater. And so, either you want more dialogue, more discussion, more talking, more action, or maybe some cutaways again. And if you're going to do cutaways, this is the perfect time to go to Camp Half-Blood. After all, you still want to see Luke, like I said. And they even have a moment where they call him via Rainbow, so I think it would work. Next up is the episode We Take a Zebra to Vegas. Which, well, yeah, this episode, it has to be meaty. Like, really meaty. So much needs to happen here. You need to have the trip to Vegas in the back of the zoo truck, which has some pretty important trio bonding stuff about Annabeth's dad, and the whole mess with Talia and the tree, and Grover's guilt about how it all played out. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this actually gets the snippy snip in the end. After all, in this episode, they still have to do the whole Lotus Hotel, which goes quickly on the page, but to make the audience understand, visually you need time to cook. Plus, you might want to show Nico and his sister. Who knows? I think it would be quite clever to introduce them early, just in a sort of background context. On top of that, they need to have another big trio conversation at the end, but this time, it's more about the main plot, about what's going on in the story, and you might need that just to touch base and keep everyone up to date. And then you have the whole Santa Monica Pier and getting the pearls from one of Poseidon's servants, before you move on to the whole waterbed shop and Krusty the Giant. But honestly, I think if anything hits the cutting room floor, it's going to be Krusty the Giant. It's literally just there to have Percy do something clever and badass. But it really does serve nothing to the story beyond that. I mean, I guess it could stay around, but I wouldn't be shocked either if it disappears. Especially since I've seen that they may explore Poseidon and Sally's backstory, and when Percy goes into the water and gets the pearls, I don't know, it might be a good time for that to play out in like a vision from his dad or something like that. And then we're into the home stretch, the final 2 episodes. We find out the truth, sort of, which will likely be the trip down into the Underworld, and then Percy meeting Uncle Hades, having to escape said angry uncle, and then having a battle with Ares. And I feel like the battle is probably the cliffhanger ending of the episode, although I guess they could even extend it out to Olympus and even Percy's apartment. But yeah, of course, next up you go to the fateful meeting with the gods on Olympus and the heart-to-heart with his dad, Poseidon, before he reunites with his mum and they do the whole reveal about Gabe being a wife-beater. Although, I feel like once again, the audience should already be clued in on this. Having this reveal at the end, I feel like it's more a Percy realization. I feel like the audience should already know, understand. Percy then encourages his mum to straight up murder him with Medusa's head, and then you have the whole Luke betrayal at the end. And obviously, all of that's going to be in the final episode. Maybe you'd open up the final episode with Olympus. Maybe. Who knows? But yeah, really, that's all, folks. Like, that's the story. And the more I look at it, despite the relatively short length of the book, I do wonder whether they're going to have to cut things a little bit in the latter sections of the show, where the episodes are actually smashed together quite closely when you look at their position in the book. And therefore, I think they're going to really emphasize the battles, especially that fight with Ares at the end. That's going to be really special and important. And the Luke reveal at the end. I feel like leaving that on a cliffhanger ending, that's not what you want. And so, now that I've sort of talked through it, it does make me a little bit nervous, because looking back now, so much epic shit happens in the last few chapters, and it would be a really big shame if they don't have enough time to let the action breathe, or have to cut some dialogue or some sequences. It would just be sad. Like, yeah, I do have faith in Rick and the show's vision, at least for now, but I just have a feeling. But yeah, beyond that, not much else to say. And so I guess I'll remind you that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of my content breakdown? You think it'll mostly play out like I said? Any cuts or additions that you might think would work? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.